welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint some of the new Mark 6 Space Marines from the Horus Heresy box game. Games Workshop sent me the new box, so I'm intending to paint the whole box as Imperial Fists, and you can see on the screen there's already one complete. I'm not just going to be painting the whole box, I've actually bought some of my own models as well, and they're all going in the army. So you can look forward to a few videos that will feature Imperial Fists. For this video I am going to be using an airbrush and some oil washes. If you don't have those, don't worry, I will be doing some future videos which won't feature these, just to make it a little bit more easy if you don't have some of the kind of like, I don't want to say more advanced, but kind of like more sort of extreme elements of hobby painting. If you just want to use basic paints and things, the future videos will be more for you. Here you can see the Mark 6 Sergeant, or like a variation of it that I've built anyway, with a nice power claw and plasma pistol. Now, to start with, I'm using Mournfang Brown. Now, if you don't have an airbrush, it's not that big a deal at this stage. I am thinning the Mournfang with some Tamiya X20A airbrush thinner, or acrylic thinner. I've found that that's pretty handy for stopping any kind of clogs. But you can just cover the whole model, paint it by hand, and it just take a bit longer. I do find that using an airbrush when you're batch painting specifically will really speed up the process. And that's why I chose to do this as the first video using the airbrush, because it's just a lot quicker. Even then, I did discover that I hate batch painting. So for me, focusing more on each one model at a time as I go through, it's not the quickest process, but it's just a bit more satisfying because you get to see a complete model each time when you do it as well. So really, it's up to you if you want to batch paint or not. But apart from that, it's pretty straightforward. Just and even if I wasn't going to batch paint, generally, trying to get the whole squad with the airbrushing done first is, it's fairly quick, so it's worth doing. Just kind of that level of batch painting to start with. So you already saw that I used the Mournfang Brown, and I covered all the models in that. So it's a 10-man squad that I'm painting. So here I'm adding a bit of white to the Mournfang Brown. This is going to be like a highlight placement. Now, obviously, Imperial Fists aren't brown and then light brown, but this gives a good base to put the yellow paint on top of it. And all I'm doing is just mixing in some white paint into the Mournfang Brown and thinner mix. I'm using P3 Morrow White. You don't have to use that. You can use pretty much any white you want, really. I just find that the P3 is pretty similar in finish to the Games Workshop paints. You can actually use Games Workshop white as well. It's not my, they're not my favourites in terms of. I find them a little bit more kind of sort of like cottage cheese, the white paint, but they're still perfectly usable. I just the P3 Morrow White is just a little bit kind of smoother, I find. So. Again, pretty straightforward using your airbrush. I'm using size 0.4 needle and around about 30 psi. It's just a case of placing the highlights. This is like pre-highlighting, pre-shading, that kind of thing. I'm just placing the highlights where I think they'd look good. You can hold it under a lamp to see where the light would naturally fall, but in this case, especially because it's gaming stuff, you don't have to be that precise, and because it's a very soft, smooth gradient that you're going to be applying with the airbrush, you can be a little bit more kind of artistic, if you like, for where you place it. I'm still because also I'm taking into account that I want the model to look good all the way around. It doesn't really have that much in terms of golden angle. You can do it like that if you want to make it look particularly good from one angle, but because these are just very quick gaming pieces, I'm trying to give them a very kind of even sort of look all the way around. That's not to say I won't focus a bit more on the head and chest, but apart from that, the process is going to be the same all the way around. So for the lighting and things, I'm still picking areas that are upwards facing, but it's just to give it like a light dusting. So if the leg is facing downwards, so you can see like on the kneecaps and things, they stay dark. The shoulder pads, when they're facing up, they go light. The head's light, the chest light. Turn it around at the back, the legs at the calves, they face upwards, so they're light. It's all pretty straightforward, I think you can see. Don't go too heavy with it. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you do, but the lighter you make it, the more yellow it's going to be when you apply it, and it is beneficial to have a slightly darker yellow, and you'll see why. And by a darker yellow I mean darker due to the base color that you're applying it on, not the actual color of the yellow. So after you've put the airbrush coat on it, it will look sort of darker just because there's Mournfang brown underneath. So here you can see I'm applying the yellow. Make sure you thin it enough. For the sergeant here, I hadn't quite thinned it quite enough, so it's a slightly thicker coat. I mean, it doesn't make any difference really, but you'll get a smoother coat with the slightly thinner paint. And you're just going over all the previous highlights that you've already put on using the Mournfang brown mixed with a small amount of white, and just making sure that it looks good again from every angle, while still having some shadows there, and you're placing the highlights where you think they'll look good. But you can still see, like at the sides of the legs, on the underarms, all sorts of areas like that, it's still dark. You don't have to be super neat, you don't have to be perfect at airbrushing. Try and avoid speckling. Like if you use the thinner, it should help with that a lot. But when you add the oil washes and things later on, that will tend to cover up any of this, and it'll just leave a very slight kind of like just a battle worn texture on it. So again, don't worry too much about all these kind of things. So at this stage you should have about 10 yellow marines. Next we're going to fill in the black areas and the metal areas. Again, very straightforward. What you will find is, because and by the way, the yellow I was using was Yriel yellow. But when you fill in the black areas and the metal areas, they will look very high contrast because the yellow is quite strong at this stage. Here I'm using Mephiston red just to quickly fill in the sergeant head stripe. So for Imperial Fists, it varies a little bit, but generally for the Horus Heresy, their sergeants have a red stripe on their head. There are some variations depending on like if they're heavy weapon marines or things like that. But the sergeants tend to have a red stripe on their head. If they don't have a plume, then it'll be a red stripe down the middle of the head. But because he's got a plume, I just assume that painting that red will do the same job. You could also paint a red stripe down the middle of his head as well if you want, just to make him look a bit kind of more sergeanty. Here you can see I'm painting the eyes black, and I did a pretty bad job there on his left, our right. The eyes are actually pretty big here on the models. They're actually really nice for being able to get your brush in, and also because I caught that edge there. You see, I'm not tidying it up. I just made the eye a little bit bigger by going catching the rim of the eye. So don't worry too much about it, because all the effects that I'm going to be doing, so I'm going to be putting OSL blue on the eyes. OSL is object source lighting. I'm basically going to make it look like the eyes glow. So all of that area will be painted over anyway. The black will just help to get some of the shape and definition in there, and also paint the weapon black. So for this, it's obviously he's holding a plasma pistol, but the other marines have bolt guns, and mine will have the chain blade attachment on. In the box, that you have the option of leaving them as plain bolt guns. They can have a bayonet or the chain blade. So whatever you fancy the look of. I really like the look of the chain blades. They are the best weapon as well in terms of combat, but you pay the points for them. But I don't care about that. I just care about what they look like. And I think it makes them look a bit more brutal. Here I'm using some Vallejo, what colour was it? Exhaust Manifold. and you will notice that I'm not painting the metallics black to start with. Normally, if you're painting metallics onto a model, starting from a black base will give you a much better finish. I do find that for these colours, they cover quite nicely. You might find a little bit when you're painting them on that you get a tiny amount of translucency, so you can see a hint of yellow showing through. It really doesn't matter. When you put the oil wash on, it's just going to tidy it all together. These are designed for airbrushing though, so they are very wet. They'll flow really nicely. That's great in terms of speed, so you can paint these on very, very quickly. The negative is because they flow so well, that if you catch a little recess or close to a painted area, the paint will flow onto that as well. So you have to try and be a little bit neater when you do it, especially on the studs on the shoulder pads. Those are a bit of a pain, having to paint all of those, and it's very easy to get it into the recess. And you can see, like, I've not done a perfect job, but the oil wash tidies it up enough. And again, it's just a tabletop mini, so getting the job done is more important than being perfect on these, because when you get the whole squad together, when you look at them, they will look great as a whole squad, and even better, like if you get a whole army painted, it will just look amazing. You don't have to make each model look perfect, because it's not for a competition. You're not painting each model for a golden demon. You're just painting them to get them on the table and look good together. Here you can see the copper that I'm painting for the coils on the plasma pistol. I'm not going to put any OSL effect on any of the weapons, so you can see obviously he's got a power claw or lightning claw, as well as his plasma pistol. And loads of people like to use airbrush for the OSL effects on those, make them look like they're glowing. I've done it myself in the past as well, and I prefer like the more kind of industrial, grimy look, and then just having the eyes as the sort of focal point. So everything is just going to be metal on my guys. There's not going to be any OSL apart from the eyes. Here you can see I just gave the model a coat of gloss varnish. Very quick one. You don't have to be perfect, don't have to get it into the recesses too much or anything like that. Just make sure you just cover the model. And now I'm going to be at this stage that you put on the decals or the transfers, depending on how you want to say it. So I am using the transfers that you could get from Forge World, the Imperial Fist ones. I believe they've taken them off of the shop, which was a bit of a surprise to me because I ordered them only a few days ago and got them, but they are missing at the moment. I presume that they've got something planned and maybe they're going to be repackaged or something like that. Don't quote me on it, I don't know, but that would be my assumption. However, you also get Imperial Fist, and you get the Horus's what are they called, the green guys, the bad guys, whatever. You get transfers for both sets of the Marines in the box. Sons of Horus, there you go. So even if you don't have the it's a really nice transfer set, to be fair. From Forge World, you can still have Imperial Fist transfers because they come in the box anyway. And you can see, so I applied it with Microsol. I don't bother with I applied it with Microset. I don't bother with Microsol. It just softens it and makes it fit kind of better for surfaces. I just find it's a waste of time. Go straight for the Microset, put a layer of that down, bang the transfer on, put another layer of Microset on top, leave it for a good few hours so it's had time to dry, and for the chemical reaction to rub off the sort of like the plastic film. Then once it's all dry, sometimes you might find if it's got little bubbles in or whatever, rub over the top of it, like roll it, don't scrub it with a little cotton bud. It'll just push out any air bubbles. But when it's dry, give it another coat of gloss varnish over the top. Wait for that to dry. It should be pretty quick, and then we're straight into covering it with the oil wash. So I'm using burnt umber and black as a mix. Burnt sienna and black as a mix. You can use burnt umber as well to get a very similar look to it. It's just like a dirty brown colour. I like mixing them myself because some colours work better with slightly more browny, so that would be more of the sienna, the burnt sienna. Some work better with more of the black in it, so it's entirely up to you. Or you could just buy more paint tubes. It doesn't really matter. You mix this with the thinner, not the X 28A thinner. Do not use that. This is mineral spirits, so I'm using Winsor and Newton Sansodor odorless thinner. I do heavily recommend that you use odorless, especially if you're painting a lot of marines at the same time. You don't want to be getting high or passing out from using strong smelling solvents. And just thin it down so you're almost to the level of a wash, or pretty much exactly really to the level of a wash. Like if you're using something like Agrax Earthshade or something like that, that's sort of the consistency you want it to be once you've mixed it all, like the thinner and the two colours together. Or if you just use one, as I said, burnt umber or something like that. Regardless, thinner and paint together should be pretty thin. And you cover the model, and he's going to look really, really dark and grimy. Then take a small pool of the thinner, the solvent, clean your brush off, and then just load it up with the thinner and start painting on the model where you want the focal points to be. So this will mean that the paint will then run off, and you can start pushing the paint around. So remember, because this is oil paint, this won't dry very quickly at all. You have a long time to push the paint where you need it to be, so you get the exact look you want in terms of highlight placement. You've already got some highlight placement from when you use your airbrush, but now you can decide if you want areas to be a little bit more grimy or a bit cleaner. So I want the shoulder pads to be cleaner. I want the leg striding forward to be cleaner. Obviously the head and the chest area, those I want to be cleaner as well. His bum plate and the leg that sticks up at the back here, I also want that to be cleaner. So, and it's just a case of, so you need a little bit of kitchen roll. Keep dipping your paintbrush into the solvent to clean it off. Rub it on your kitchen roll as well in between, so you kind of like you're pulling off the excess from the model. And so, I mean, I know it looks very messy at this stage. Don't worry too much about like if it looks messy, because it will dry a lot neater than it looks at the moment. It is a case of trusting the process when layering all this stuff on. Here you can see, so it's dried now. I left this overnight, and it's really important that it's dry for this next stage. So I'm going to put the sand on the base. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows how to do this, but I'm just using PVA glue. Cover the whole base in it, like keep it quite thick as well. A tip is to use a small amount of water with your PVA just so it flows a bit better. It'll make the job quicker, and it just be able to push it around and get it exactly where you want it to go. But very simple, straightforward. I want these bases to be as quick and easy to complete as possible. So actually, I mean, I hardly use any paint on them. It's very, very cheap technique. When that's mostly dry, I water down the PVA glue some more. So now it's very thin. It's almost like a wash, a little bit thicker than like a Games Workshop wash, but still you can still see it's glue. So it's not completely see-through or anything like that. And then just go over the top of it again. You don't have to wait until it's dry. Actually, I didn't. Again, I was rushing through this, but if you just load up over the top of the sand, and this is it's a really good tip, this, because I always used to, I would put the sand on, leave it, and then start painting it afterwards, and you'd always get bits of sand fall off because there's clumps of sand and they don't all get equal amounts of glue. But when you put the glue on top, and especially when it's watered down, it soaks all the way through. The sand is now rock solid from top to bottom, and you can paint it and not worry about flakes of sand coming off. Now, this stage, you do have to make sure that the glue's dry. You can speed up the process with a hairdryer. I did that. If you saw the Blood Angel video, that was sped up. The whole thing was sped up using a hairdryer because I was trying to get the whole thing done within an hour. But this, I didn't bother to use the hairdryer. I just left the model again and carried on working on more of the squad. But this is just some Agrax Earthshade and just slather it on the base. You don't even have to be that neat. Don't worry about catching a bit on the boots or anything. They're already dirty from the oil wash, and it just makes it, all look a bit more dirty, which is not a big problem. And we're going to be putting some weathering powder on the feet as well, and things like that. For the eagle-eyed among you, you may have noticed earlier on, before I did the washing, that the eagle, the Imperial eagle on his forehead, I didn't paint it metallic. I missed it, but it is done now. I spotted that myself, and I had to go back and quickly do a quick oil daub on top of it. But these things happen. But it's done now anyway. So this stage, this is quite an important one, and it will make a huge difference to the look of the model. I'm using matte varnish. Again, it's the Mecha varnish, matte varnish that I'm using from Vallejo, and just cover the model again. You might find that some of the shiny spots are a bit awkward and they won't vanish that easily, so just let it dry a bit and give it multiple coats. At the end of the day, it's not going to be a complete disaster if you've got some areas that are a tiny bit more shiny, but you will be able to fix it if you just do multiple coats. So at this stage, like if you wanted, I think at this stage, if you could get your whole army painted to this standard, it would still look great on the tabletop. This is just a case of me wanting to push the painting side a bit more and make it a bit more interesting. Here in the top left, you can see there is Yriel yellow, and then I've also done another bit of yellow in the top left where I've added some white to the Yriel yellow. But that isn't so important. What is important is that you thin the yellow down enough. Because it has the matte varnish over the top of the layers of paint already, what that does is it'll create a slightly rough textured surface on the model. And if you have watered down the yellow enough when you apply it, I actually haven't quite watered it down enough at the start, but I do add a bit more water later on. You want it's around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. What you'll find is that if the paint's wet enough, it'll kind of bleed a little bit when it touches the model, and you get it kind of like helps with creating a very sort of soft transition, especially for getting it done quickly. I find that really useful. However, if you've watered down the paint around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, and then you start painting in some edge highlights or details, then you're going to suffer a little bit because it's not as easy to get the edges painted with the very thin paint. When placing these highlights, it is more your choice, for what looks good. In terms of this model, because he has such a really nice, forward advancing pose, it's the top shoulder pad for his lightning claw, his face, forehead, like the beak obviously catches a nice amount of light, and the shoulder pad reaching forward, the top of his thigh, then pick out a few edges here and there, and it'll be the same on the back as well. You can spend a little bit of time blending the shoulder pad. I say a little bit, like about a couple of minutes basically, just blending it, just so that you don't get obvious brush streaks on there. It's not the end of the world if you do have a few brush streaks. Again, it's supposed to be a gaming piece, but it does kind of look a little bit better if you don't have very obvious brush direction marks on the model. And also, so when you load the brush up as well, because the paint's a bit thinner, make sure that you brush the excess paint off before you apply it to the model. Me personally, I rub it along my thumb. You can see a little bit there at the bottom of the video. And lots of people, put the paint on their hand just to take the excess paint off and to make sure that you get a tip on your brush. But if you don't want to do that, you can just run it, on a bit of kitchen towel, or even just on the palette if you dragging the paint through the sort of a cleaner area on the palette, again just to take that excess paint off. And you can see on the shoulder pads that when I'm painting them, I'm not painting the whole shoulder pad. Like, I don't want the whole model to be this bright yellow, only the focal points. So really the head, chest and shoulders, they're where the highlight goes. Those are the important parts to get the yellow. And oddly enough, this will make the yellow look brighter and more vibrant by using less of it. So you get that contrast between the two. If you had gone and just painted all of the armor panels the same way, it would look very yellow, but you won't get the focal points. They won't stand out as nicely, and it'll take a lot longer. And this is way quicker, just painting small areas of highlights. It makes them stand out. It makes it more dramatic looking. Oh, and here's a little tip as well. If you want to blend it in quickly and you just want to get it done, and you're not too worried about perfect blending, small amount of paint on the brush, just use the tip, do scribbly motions, almost like circles, but try not to be too regular in the marks that you make, and it will hide the brush marks. It adds a little bit of texture to it, but by texture I mean painted on texture, not texture in terms of an actual 3D bumpy surface. Again, it's just making the armor panels look a little bit worn, but you can see there on the shoulder now, so you can't really see the brush marks anymore, and it's just very simple having these sort of squiggly marks on there to blend between the clean, fresh yellow from the Yriel yellow compared to the oil shaded Yriel yellow underneath it. For the face as well, you don't have to paint the whole of the face. Also, remember, I'm going to be painting some OSL blue on the eyes, so don't bother painting on the lower edge of the eyes. Keep that dark. In fact, it actually works better to keep it dark. So the temptation might be to highlight under the eyes, and you think, well, maybe it'll help with the OSL. No, it actually hinders it. Keeping it dark will help with the contrast, the brightness of the eyes. Again, the back, same thing. Depends how much time you want to spend making the models look interesting. If you're painting the back of them, it's mainly going to be what you're going to see on the battlefield rather than what your opponent sees, but of course they are your models, so you probably do want them to look nice when you're looking at the backs of them. But don't worry too much about getting a perfect finish. You can see here better now how the paint is watered down, and it's a lot quicker to get the layers down without getting any brush marks on there. If you remember when I was painting the front, the brush marks were a little bit more obvious. Also, don't worry too much that it's slightly out of sync with the wet palette. I recorded extra wet palette video accidentally, and then it was a lot of effort to sync it up, so I just left it. Try and avoid getting bits of hair on the model as well. You could see there I was painting and a bit of hair stuck to it, but I just didn't care at that point. But honestly though, it is best to try and avoid bits of debris and things when you're painting, because if you see them afterwards and then you pull them off, it will leave an indentation, and they'll be where they were is still visible even if you pulled the hair off afterwards. So here it's just a final little highlight. This is entirely optional, just to pick out a few parts on the focal points. So this was the Yriel yellow mixed with white. Mainly just use it on the face, just to pick out like the tip of his nose and the shine spot on his forehead, things like that. The main reason actually for this colour is when at the very end, when I just do a little bit of chipping and weathering to make the chips look three-dimensional. So if you don't want to do this stage, it's not going to make a huge difference, and you can leave it, but that colour mix of the Yriel yellow with a small amount of white is handy for the chipping. So for the plume on his head, we're going back with the Mephiston red, and just very quickly painting in blocks of the hair, and just leave the gaps in the darkest recesses where the oil has run in, and it makes them look a little bit more 3D, pops a bit better, and you're creating a bit more saturation, because obviously when you added the dark oil wash on top, it made them look a bit dull. So now painting the red back just brings it out, makes it look a bit more vibrant. And then here, just quickly on top, I'm going back with a bit of Evil Sun Scarlet, just in a small area, to again just push the brightness of the highlight. Don't go too crazy with this. Just pick out a few bits. You don't even have to go all the way around. If you just focus more on the middle section, it helps with the focal point a little bit. There you go. Very quick and easy. Don't forget to do the back of that as well. I did paint the back, just not on the video. Alright, so Sotek green for the eyes. I know I said they're blue. Sotek green, it is basically blue. It's just got a bit of green colour in it. It's like my favourite blue, but it's sort of a greeny blue. Then all we're doing, we fill in the eye very quickly with the Sotek green. I had it quite watered down, around about 50-50 water to paint. I'm only going to show you one eye because the other eye is really hard to paint because of the angle of the direction of the camera. You basically can't see it as I paint it, so it's easier for me just to show you on one side, and then you can figure out how to do the other side on your own. You can see here on the wet palette in the top left, so I have the three colours. I have at the bottom left the Sotek green, in the middle added a bit of white to it, top it's mostly white with a small amount of Sotek green. You can just see just off to the left there of the wet palette I added excess water to it, so I've turned it into a glaze now. Glaze just means it's a very thin layer of paint. Load up your brush with it. So it's probably, I would say, around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint there. Load up your brush, rub off a lot of the excess on some kitchen roll. And then what you're doing is you're painting, kind of like pick up an area lower down on the faceplate and then drag the brush up towards the eye. Don't paint in the other direction. Really important that you always paint up towards the eye here, because if you paint down it's going to leave a larger deposit of paint. It'll be a blob, it'll be a harder mark, it'll look messy, and you probably get a bit of like a tea staining hard line lower down as well, whereas this, it creates more of a transition going up towards the eye, and this will then work as the blue glow. So then the next stage is just paint the middle of the eye with the first stage highlight, which again Sotek green mixed with a small amount of white, around about 50-50 water to paint. Doesn't matter exactly for the consistency, as long as you can get a fairly opaque layer. You might need to do multiple layers to make it look really nice and bright. I strongly recommend that you let each layer dry before you paint the next layer, or as you will pick up some of the previous layer and damage the paint layer if you go over it before it's dried. And also we're just at this stage painting a little highlight along the lower edge of the eye socket. And then we're going over again with the third mix, which again majority white paint with a small amount of Sotek green. The idea is each time that you layer over these colours, you leave a tiny little amount at the edge of each layer where the lower layer is still visible. So you're creating a transition. You still want the eye to look quite bright, almost white, and indeed for the final highlight here I am actually taking it up to white. I just don't have it on the wet palette visible on the camera, but there is some white paint on my wet palette, and you can see here just a much smaller area, so not covering the eye, just a kind of like sort of the center-ish of the eye, doing a quick layer of white, and there you go. So now it looks like the eye is glowing. The model looking pretty good at this stage. Now it's just the final highlights on the metals. Everywhere that you painted the exhaust manifold colour, and by the way you don't have to use exhaust manifold as a metallic colour, you can use pretty much any metallic sort of steelish kind of colour, and you'll get very similar results due to the oil wash anyway. This just adds a tiny bit of colour to it. It's just my preference in colour, but it's not going to make a huge difference. Like if you have I'm not completely sure what the names of the colours are for the Games Workshop metallics. I know there used to be a bulk gun metal colour, but I don't believe they use that anymore, that name. But something like that, you could use that and it would be fine. But that kind of colour, sort of like a dark metal colour. Don't go for anything like a mithril silver analog or chrome. That would be too bright. Just look a bit weird and shiny. And then all you're doing is it's basically the same as what you just did with the yellow. You're picking the sort of brighter areas and making them highlighted. Kind of focus where the light would naturally fall, same as you did with the where you painted on the yellow. So you're not going to go back and paint over the whole area of the metallics, only the areas that catch the most light. So there will be parts that still look a bit dull due to the matte varnish that was applied on it. One of the final things here is just to paint in some highlights on the plasma gun. I've used German grey and neutral grey here. I know my wet palette looks a bit of a mess at this stage. I tilted it a bit and some of the water had got on top of the palette and blended things together and stuff like that. I know not usually like me with the nice circles that I'd use, but I just didn't care. I just needed to get it. I was nearly finished, and I needed to get some grey on the plasma pistol. And it's just, block in some highlight positions. Again, just hold the model under a lamp and see naturally. But really, for this one, the best highlight follows sort of like a quarter down from the top, or a third down from the top line going across it. So start with German grey, then neutral grey, and then sort of dip the brush back in the German grey without washing it off. So you can see there, just dipped it back in the German grey, and with the neutral grey still on the brush from originally, it'll actually blend the colours together. And if you just keep working it, you'll get a very smooth transition on this small area very quickly. And then once you've done that, you go back with the neutral grey, pick out a load of the edge details. Don't spend too long on it. No one's going to care really how many details you picked out on the plasma pistol, especially now that the rules for them, they've been nerfed a little bit from the previous editions, so they're not great marine killers anymore. I mean, they're good, but they're not. What should I say? They're not going to be deleting Space Marines every turn. So there you go, just very quick, simple edge highlights. All you have to do, the main thing is just to make sure you don't have too much paint on your brush, so you don't get any blobs. When the paintbrush touches the model, it's not going to spread out or anything like that. Also, do the same thing on the other side of the plasma pistol as well. And it's pretty much finished now. The only thing that I'm going to do is some optional weathering. This, as I just said, it's optional. So if you don't want your Space Marines to look a bit scratched and battle worn, that's fine. Just leave it at this stage. Don't bother with this. I'm using some Rhinox hide and just putting some. It's basically just dots, little dots and dashes all the way around, looking where I think the armour would be scraped a bit more. Also, if you've got areas on the model where the paint, so like the oil wash, hasn't settled very well and it looks kind of awkward, you can turn that into a weathered area. It's always really handy. Weathering is great for hiding poor paint jobs. So if you've messed up on various parts of the model, just get some Rhinox hide, do some little dots around that area. It'll kind of camouflage it. But otherwise, when you're placing them, look for placing them so like at the edges of armour. Those would naturally catch a bit more damage. And also the feet, obviously they're probably kicking things all the time, like spare Space Marine heads and things rolling around the battlefield. So probably a bit of chipping on the feet, a few scratches on the shoulder pads. It makes it a bit more interesting to look at. But don't spend a long time doing this. It's very easy to go over the top with the weathering, or just to get like, oh, I'm really enjoying this. It's very, you can just put little dots all over the place to make it look interesting, and just get lost in what you're doing. I have that trouble actually on just details in general. I really enjoy the final stages of painting a model, so the first areas are really boring, getting all the airbrush and stuff out of the way. It's not that interesting to me, but when I get to the final sort of highlights and adding on extra details, I could just spend hours and hours doing this. And really the challenge for me is to stop myself doing all this rubbish. But if you do too much, it will overload the model and you'll actually lose a lot of all the nice light placements and things that you'd already got on there. You can see I've already done a few, but so remember that yellow mix that I was talking about with Yriel yellow mixed with a small amount of white. All you've got to do to pick out a few of these, make them look three-dimensional, just do a highlight along the lower edge. Now I know it can be easier said than done, especially if your hand-eye coordination might not be perfect. And this is the one area on the model really, picking out these lower edge highlights where it can be a bit tricky. What I would suggest is, if you find that the highlight when you place it on is a bit too much of a blob, go back with the Rhinox hide, paint over the chip again, and what you find is you can cut into the highlight if if it's too big, and you'll create a really nice crisp edge highlight, because some of it will still be left. It's just that it'll make it all look a lot cleaner and neater. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all the painting on the model done. So now it's just to create the nice dusty effect. I'm using Forge World Dark Sand, and I just use a nice big soft brush and really go to town on covering the feet. Make sure you get like a good amount on there. In fact, I would say you can't go too heavy, but clearly you could go too heavy. But don't be afraid to get a lot on there. So, and then what I'm just finally doing here is using some matte varnish again, just to seal it on there. Now, what you will find is that it dulls down as it's wet, but then it should lighten again. If it doesn't lighten enough, just do another layer, just keep repeating it a few times, and you'll get like a really thick, crusty, dirty look to the feet. But anyway, and that's the end of the video. As I mentioned, I'm doing a lot of these Horus Heresy models. I'm going to do some other legions as well. You can already see that I have another video with the Blood Angel, but there's also going to be lots of variations on different ways to paint them as well, and as I said, lots of Imperial Fists to come. So anyway, please subscribe, because there's lots to see. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.